Hello. Thanks for joining me tonight for an episode of True Crime and Legal Update. This episode is going to cover the James Tolliver Craig trial out of Colorado, the dentist accused of poisoning his wife, Angela. Now, we've already covered the first week. This is week 2. We'll add an extra day to complete the 10 full days of testimony for the prosecution's case. They have presented already 50 witnesses. And as of July 28th, that was the last day of the prosecution's case. So this particular episode is going to cover the testimonies from July 21st through July 28th. Let's get started. So for week 2, the testimony in the state versus James Tolliver Craig in Colorado, this full week of testimony covered the prosecution's remaining main evidence against the former Aurora dentist, including forensics, toxicology, expert analysis, jailhouse solicitation schemes, and key testimony from Craig's romantic partner, Karen King. Nearly all prosecution witnesses have now taken the stand as both sides rested on Monday, July 28th. With closing arguments imminent, now we're going to go over the day-by-day synthesis from July 21st, the first day of week 2. This evidence is mapping the principal witness testimony to each material charge. We're also going to update the probability of a guilty verdict for each charge as we go. For procedural context, now that we've had 50 witnesses and over 10 days of prosecution testimony, James Craig faces first-degree murder. Charge 2 and 3 are solicitation to tamper with physical evidence. Charge 4 and 5 are solicitation to commit perjury. And charge 6 is solicitation to commit first-degree murder. So let's go on to the day-by-day witnesses in regards to this that the prosecution brought forward. On Monday, July 21st through Tuesday, July 22nd, these are days 6 and 7 of the trial, we had medical and toxicology evidence. And we also heard from a jailhouse informant. First up was Dr. Mark Simon. He's the medical toxicologist, and he testified to massively elevated cyanide and tetrahydrozoline in Angela Craig's blood, near double the lethal dose. Noted that no accident or natural cause could explain the presence of the drugs. He said he saw no evidence of suicide in the medical record or in the family texts, and he does not believe that Angela poisoned herself. Now, how does that relate to the charges? Well, it's direct evidence for murder, and it rebutes the defense's theory of suicide, that Angela did this to herself. We then heard from another toxicologist, Dr. Lisa Lear. The jury asked questions of this toxicologist from her testimony prior, and they asked if she had ever worked a similar fatality. And the answer was no. Only 3 cyanide deaths, none like this. They also confirmed that there was no suicide text pattern in the married couple's communications. All the text messages between Angela Craig and James Tolliver Craig did not really contain any suicidal annotations from Angela, any hint that she was that depressed that she would do it. Now, this actually supported the deliberate poisoning and undermines again the suicide defense that's being put forward. With each witness, the prosecution is laying out a timeline and also reinforcing that Angela did not do this to herself, and laying out that timeline in such a way that it shows that the only one who had access to Angela and the cyanide was James Tolliver Craig. He had motive, he had means, and he had opportunity. Another witness that took the stand was Casey Bohannon. Now, this is the jailhouse informant. Okay, this is one of the jailhouse informants. This one testified that Craig asked for help planting the fake suicide journal in Angela's handwriting in Craig's house or vehicle, and also, provided the map of the home's camera layout. And Bohan refused to do this for Mr. Craig and reported it to the police. Now, this jailhouse informant showed that James Craig actually mapped everything out step by step how the evidence could be falsified against to show that Angela perhaps did this to herself. This is strong evidence for solicitation to tamper with physical evidence in perjury. It proves intent to mislead by fabricating evidence, trying to hire people to do it for him. This didn't look good for James Craig. The next person to take the stand was Dr. Karen Kane. This is the romantic partner at the time of James Craig, the orthodontist that he was having an affair with. She testified about thousands of text messages with James Craig before and after Angela's death. She described Craig as insistent that he didn't drug Angela. Prosecutors entered text messages where Craig discussed future plans post Angela's death and blamed Angela's poisoning on suicidal ideation, on supposed suicidal ideation. Again, blaming Angela that she did this herself. Now, that testimony established motive, the affair, and demonstrated intent and consciousness of guilt. Some of the text messages about her being sick, but he was so callous about everything. He also lied to Karen Kane about whether a place for them to live was set up, whether the divorce was actually in process, many things. He lied to Karen Kane about, and it's all out there in the text messages. It shows that it was intent to leave Angela and to be with Karen Kane, but that things were coming to a head because Karen Kane was coming to Colorado, to where he was. And Angela, well, based on the text messages with James Craig, she didn't have any idea. Their marriage was plugging along, although troubled. It was still intact, still moving forward with no threats of divorce currently. Now, they had considered divorce in the past, but they had got through it. And he cheated many, many times, as has come up in the testimony repeatedly. She was quiet about it. Well, they knew that there might have been, a situation, but they didn't know really what was going on. As the daughters testified in week 1, in some of the family and friends, they really thought that they were worked through it and everything was okay. They didn't know there was multiple affairs. And Angela did not seem depressed in any way. She had plans for the future. She had hobbies. She was involved in her daughters' lives. Didn't look like a severely depressed person. Didn't act like one. And didn't talk like one. And that is all documented in the medical records also. Then we move on 8, 9, and 10. So that's Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And we get into testimony in regards to cell phone, location, and digital evidence, and some other jury questions again. Okay. Now, in regards to cell phone data, they were able to track James Craig's motions all the way to like the office, not exactly at the office, but the tower near the office. More than likely, that is where he went. Also for the delivery and the picking up of some poisons, also back and forth from the hospital to home, to the office. Well, most importantly, about the delivery to his dentist practice that he was so concerned about, that had to be protected, that he was like trying to get there. The office was closed when it was delivered. They actually went to an employee's house to get a key to get in. Garrett Lent, the cell phone data analyst, discussed in his core testimony that he tracked James Craig's device during key moments, showed Craig near chemical supplier at relevant times, not at home, as he said, and confirmed Google searches for undetectable poison, arsenic, tetrahydrozoline, and barium on devices attributed to Craig, along with all of those searches on how to create poisons, whether they're detectable in an autopsy. It also, like, how long does it take to die from cyanide in certain poisons? You know, how to create poison cocktails. This is a direct digital link for murder planning, premeditation, and it undercounts the accident defense is that they're trying to put forward from the other side. That, you know, it was an accidental poison. Perhaps Angela accidentally got poisoned in her morning smoothies. Again, Dr. Lisa Lear took the stand to answer a jury question. The jury asked if Craig expressed concern for Angela's mental health or tried to prevent suicide. She found none in the reviewed records or the texts back and forth. None of the communications between Angela Craig and James Tolliver Craig actually expressed anything about suicide and or the prevention of it, and talking of it, or being depressed or bolstering her up. You know, he never expressed concern for Angela's mental health, not in the ER or in the hospital. This undermines the defense narrative that Craig was preventively concerned and tried to stop Angela from poisoning herself. There's no mention of it anywhere in any of the texts back and forth, and there's quite a bit of correspondence back and forth. There was more testimony on these days from Karen King, and up to 4,000 text messages were exchanged within 18 days, including expressions of love and plans for the future. Karen King had never heard of anything like this before. She figured this was quite overwhelming, and some of it just didn't sit right. Well, she cared for him, yes. She was definitely involved in this affair and moving forward, but it really undermines the stability of the marriage that the defense is putting forward. It affirms motive for murder. Okay, James Craig was working behind the scenes to end his marriage and to move forward with Karen. However, he didn't want to do it the regular way. No lawyer's fees here. We will just get rid of her. It's a little less expensive, and actually it fit into his time frame because, like I said before, he was really worried about Karen King discovering that they weren't in the process of divorce, or that, you know, he didn't have an apartment, that he was still living home with Angela and the children. You know, he had misled Karen also. And then there was the witness from Family Wellness, Mark and Renee Prey. These are family witnesses, okay, that testified to odd behavior of Dr. Craig, about Dr. Craig questioning why Angela was taken to the hospital, resisting tests, giving conflicting reports about being asleep versus hearing Angela snoring or as she crashed. He described Angela as exhausted and confused after leaving the hospital. You know, it shows, contrary to what the defense is putting forward about how Dr. Craig was so actively involved in helping sort out the medical mystery of why Angela was so sick. He knew why she was sick. He was giving conflicting information back and forth. He was planting seeds about how her mental health was compromised. That didn't make sense to anyone because it isn't anything that they saw. The only one who could testify to anything going on with her mental health that was not actually healthy was James Craig. He was the only one who said that she was depressed. Not a single word from anyone else of her being depressed at all. No documentation in the hospital record, although she was repeatedly asked. It shows a manipulative pattern and fortifies murder charge and discredits that caregiving defense that he was so attentive to her, really trying to figure it out, and had concerns that she may have done it herself that he never expressed to the medical personnel. It wasn't until after, when he needed to build a defense. So on Monday, we had our last witness on day 11 of the trial. This was the lead detective, Bobby Olson, who James Craig is also facing charges of trying through another inmate hire someone to eliminate Bobby Olson because, well, this detective annoyed him by finding out the truth. Knows a little too much. Lead detective Bobby Olson testified that James Craig wrote a lengthy iPhone note to paint Angela's death as a suicide in preparation for law enforcement attention. This is what incited James Oliver Craig to eliminate Bobby Olson. It detailed the coordination of cell phone purchase and the digital evidence. Bobby Evans was able to connect all the dots into everything that was purchased, and everything went. It was a great investigation, and it really shores up the timeline. During this actual court testimony, there was a timeline put up on the screen, and it went minute by minute, day by day, during those last days of Angela, from the preparation until her first admission, until when she lapsed into the coma. It never came out. Every visit to the hospital, everywhere he went, it pretty much mapped out a concise timeline for the jury. The relevance to the charges is this gave evidence of attempted fabrication and tampering and supports solicitation counts for the solicitation of murder. Also, the solicitation to perjure. When he was going to hire witnesses, James Craig offered to hire witnesses to come forward and say that they were friends of Angela and that she was depressed over all of these multiple affairs. Also, have other women say they were in affairs with him and that Angela knew about it. And this is why she was so depressed. The prosecution rested on Monday after nearly 50 witnesses. And to our surprise, the defense didn't call a single witness. No experts to challenge the cell data or any of the other information that came forward. No medical experts to come through to talk about, her condition, Angela's condition. Because remember, the defense isn't denying that Angela died from poisoning. They didn't bring anyone forward, not even a mental health expert, to try to counter that Angela could have been hiding her depression. Nothing. Nor did James Tolliver Craig take the stand. The man proclaiming to be so innocent and so upset that the only reason he wrote a letter to his daughter to try to get her to help him put in false evidence and give false statements in regards to her mother, that he only wrote that letter because he was so distraught. The only thing that the jury's going to get from the defense is the cross-examination they did. Now, in week one, they tried to discredit the witnesses, talking about how credibility of witnesses matter and that some of these were jailhouse inmates. That the investigation itself was so narrow in scope because they only focused on James Craig. And it could have been anyone else. Well, they focused on James Craig because he ordered the poison. He picked up the poison. He had access to the poison. And he was the one who was giving her a smoothie every morning. They showed during the trial household video from the in-house cameras of the Craig household, where the tumbler that she drank from every day is in his possession. They even show him making a smoothie at one time. Of course, there's no evidence of him putting the poison in it, but the routine is established. It's well known through communications with Angela and James Craig that he made her that breakfast smoothie every morning. There's documentation of when she started to feel ill after drinking the smoothie several times. Text messages back and forth. it proved that he had the availability. He had access to be able to do it. You know, there wasn't a lot of, sometimes there was audio and no visual, and sometimes there was visual and no audio. What? Liz were not able to find the container with the poison in it. It was all well scrubbed before the house had been searched and evidence gathered. But there's plenty of video of him with the containers, having access to them, making the smoothies, talking about the smoothies with Angela back and forth, and about when she started to feel ill after drinking them several times. But during week 2, there was no real impeachment of the prosecution's evidence by the defense. They really couldn't poke many holes in the lead detective Bobby Olson's testimony, nor the toxicology experts, but even the inmate, except for the, well, you have something to gain, right? Well, this inmate went to the police, just told James Craig straight out he wasn't going to do this, and then turned everything in. It wasn't like they were enticed with the big deal by turning it all in. He didn't know he was going to get a deal. When he turned it in, he didn't say, I'll tell you if you give me a deal. He turned it in because it was the right thing to do. There really wasn't any impeachment at all in week 2. The defense's case appeared even weaker at the end of testimony. Okay, when we go forward to map out the charges and to actually see what kind of net effect the testimony has for the week. Okay, for the first-degree murder charge, which the statutory element is deliberate, intentional killing with poison. Okay, and the key second-week witnesses were Simon and Lear and Kane, Lord in the family. And it was very strong effect for medical toxicology and motive, tightly linking Craig to all the acts, all the poisoning acts that occurred that caused Angela Craig's death. Now, for the solicitation to tamper with physical evidence, and that is requesting and planting or alteration and fabrication of that evidence, that was the jailhouse informant, also Detective Bobby Olson, who gave the best testimony in week 2 in regards to that. And the net effect was compelling. Maps, notes, jailhouse scheme go to consciousness of guilt. Why do you have to fabricate evidence to put out an alternate theory if you're innocent? Why do you have to go to all of this subtext and behind the scenes and, try to bribe people and actually, even worse things if you're innocent? Consciousness of guilt. James Craig is acting like a very guilty man. All of his actions. Letter to his daughter to try to coerce her. Conversations with inmates on how to hire to get falsification and perjury on the stand. And then third and fourth charges, for solicitation to commit perjury, for inducing false testimony, letters to the jail, false journal. Both Karen Kane, who knew about it and testified to it, and the inmate Bohannon, as well as Detective Olson, all gave testimony in week 2 in regards to these acts. He even spoke with Karen Kane about it. It supports that the jailhouse plans and the correspondence still rest partly on informant credibility. The defense did bring forward, with Karen Kane, they're talking about, she just wants to look good in this situation, so she has to make James Craig look bad. And that, she could be misinterpreting after the fact because she didn't do anything about anything that he told her. And then the jailhouse inmate, having something to gain. Well, as far as informant credibility, that's one thing. witness testimony with Karen Kane, she doesn't have anything to gain or lose by telling the truth. And why would she not? It's a tragedy. She doesn't want to be implicated. She had no idea that Angela would die. She thought they were divorcing and that he didn't even live with her anymore. So the credibility issue is really only on the inmates, you know. Of course, with Detective Olson, they tried to say that they had blinders on and they only wanted to zero in on James Tolliver Craig. But in cross-examination and then in rebuttal, it does come forward that, well, there was plenty of evidence to lead them to James Craig, and there was no credible evidence to lead them anywhere else. So if it looks like it was an investigation of only one person with blinders on, it's because they had such evidence against him. There was no need to really look elsewhere. And there was no credible evidence that pointed them elsewhere. And for the final charge of solicitation to commit murder, well, soliciting the homicide of the lead detective, etc., and all of those things that went with it. That was from the previous week, and it was reviewed will be reviewed again in the closing statements. That should happen, I believe, Tuesday. If not Tuesday, then Wednesday. Basically, the needle didn't really move much from week 1 to week 2 on that charge. There wasn't any new direct evidence that was put in. It was only brought up. The case remains moderately strong for that particular charge. Let's move on to the probability model of the verdict at the end of week 2. Okay, now this is, given the cumulative and uncontested weight of forensic, an expert in jailhouse fabrication evidence, the projected conviction probabilities using that same Bayesian mix as in the prior week, forensic and digital 40%, motive 25, consciousness of guilt 20, credibility 15, are adjusted as follows due to the extensive corroboration by the witnesses. For the first degree murder charge, okay, the prosecution gets a 93 out of 100 for proving the case, and the defense is only 13. But there's an 88% probability of a guilty verdict that James Tolliver Craig murdered his wife, Angela Craig, by poisoning her. Now, for the first solicitation to tamper physical evidence, count 1, an 84% prosecution score in week 2, and 18% for the defense, who came back with some questioning of the witnesses in regards to that, but not a lot. Mostly on credibility issues. There's still an 82% chance, estimated conviction likelihood on that charge. We go to the solicitation tampering evidence charge for count 2, and the prosecution score is a little less. They didn't present it as much. The defense score increases because there was a little more hammering on our inmate, our jailhouse inmate, okay? And that actually drops to 80%. Now, the solicitation to commit perjury, count 1, prosecution score 78. They do have the physical evidence, they have the letters, they have the testimony. 21% defense score as they try to challenge it. We don't know where this letter comes from. Well, it was actually not mailed, but that doesn't count, does it? I mean, he wrote it. It doesn't matter if the man received it or not. He wrote it with the intent of what would happen. It was intercepted by the jail system. Okay. 78% of conviction there. And a 78% conviction also for the solicitation to perjury for count 2 for the fake witnesses and etc. And the second attempt to perjure and cause falsified evidence to be submitted to the charge. 75%, a 75 score for the prosecution, and it goes up to 24 for the defense. In their cross-examination, challenging, is it really his handwriting? But then again, it does get confirmed by the daughter and by those who know. So they did try. They pushed back, maybe not as successful. Solicitation to first degree murder of Detective Olson. The prosecution score was 68. Detective Olson was on there. They do have, again, the inmate's testimony. And so on the defense pushed really hard back on this one with the inmate to say that the inmate was just trying to get out of trouble themselves and actually wanted a deal. And they got a 32 score on that. But still, probability of guilty on this is 68%. And then the reason it's lower is because all of the evidence revolves around the inmate. Okay. And so the credibility issue is pretty strong here. It is the defense's best chance is to remove all those charges because of the credibility issue of the inmates having something to gain, and whether or not the jury will take their testimony at face value. And they could be trusted. The defense is going to insist that they don't, because this person is in jail and not a good person. But then again, the prosecution counters them with, why lie? There's really not a great benefit for them here. I'd like to make note that all the numbers are evidence-based projections as of July 28th. In other words, the evidence of the testimony and what was presented in court. In the absence of final jury instructions, jury deliberation, or defense rebuttal, actual verdict outcomes depend on full deliberation and potential final defense arguments. The closing statements are still to be done. This is when both sides, the prosecution and the defense, will put forward their theory of the crime and just map out the story, so to speak. Now, that's not evidence, but during that actual argument, they can point the jury to what to look at and try to give them some considerations on how much weight to put on it and why they should put this much weight on it or not. The defense, of course, is going to do the opposite, try to steer them away from most of the damaging evidence and try to shine a light on the credibility issue with the inmates, or the fact that all of the affairs happened over all these years and that Angela wasn't happy in her marriage, blaming the victim again. Well, we shall see. It's going to come to an end this week, one way or another. As I am recording this, I do know that the jury closing statements have happened, and there'll be a video as soon as it's available so that you can listen to those. And then we will have a verdict soon. Jury instructions were read, and they deliberated for several hours before concluding for the day. And they will be back tomorrow to deliberate again. And I expect we may have a verdict by the end of the week. So, a final analysis for the week. Prosecution's strengths for the week were massive, uncontested expert testimony confirming poisoning not consistent with suicide or accident. The jailhouse witness, this one, Bohannon, compellingly detailed Craig's request to fabricate evidence and initiate false narratives. The digital and GPS evidence that triangulates the planning, delivering, and day of crime participation by James Craig with no alternative explanations offered by the defense. On the defense's position, they chose not to call witnesses. Indirect attacks centered on informant credibility only for all of week 2. No new cross-examinations or alternate timeline in week 2, so prior impeachment efforts remain the only challenge to the evidence. For the jury focus, well, they were interactive, engaged, and asked very probing questions about forensic logic, not just narrative gaps. Prosecution's answers appeared to satisfy scientific and common sense inquiry. In other words, what did the toxicologists, believe in regards to repeatedly they asked about Angela's status, mental health status, and what they thought from what they read in the record in the texts. Week 2 was long and had a lot of tedious evidence, but it did firm up the timeline. It showed that, like I said, James Tolliver Craig had access to the poison. availability to the poison, access to Angela Craig in order to give it to her. He had the motive that they are putting forth, that it was financial motive as well as romantic motive, in that he wanted to be done with this marriage to move forward with Karen King, and he needed to do it quickly because he had lied to his romantic interest in regards to things already progressing towards divorce and him not even living together with her. They were just finishing up. Thank you for joining me. I do hope to have the closing statements out for you tomorrow. As always, please don't like, share, subscribe if you like the content. Leave me a comment on this particular trial, anything that I've covered today, any questions in regards to the case, or any other case we're covering or not. I love to hear from you all. It's the interaction I like best about doing this. So, on that, have a good night, and we'll see you again soon.